Hello, Manchester, and welcome back to Ward 13. Our guests tonight were our guests last week, State Representative Tim Smith of Hillsborough District 17, which is Manchester, Ward 10, and Theo Groh of the New Hampshire Young Democrats, the president of the New Hampshire Young Democrats, the face of the Young Democrats. But Theo, in the last show, you didn't really tell us, who is Theo Groh?
So I grew up in Wilton, New Hampshire. I'm a lifelong resident of New Hampshire. I got my start in politics running for state representative. I ran against a guy you might know, Bill O'Brien.
In Mont Vernon?
Yeah, and it was a five-town
That's
district.
Part of the district?
Temple, Wilton, Limeboro, Mont Vernon, and New Boston.
It's a rough district for a Democrat.
It's a rough district in 2010 running against Bill O'Brien. But it was a real lesson in kind of what Bill O'Brien and the Tea Party in New Hampshire stood for. And so that really got me very fired up about state politics and local politics and how much of a difference you can make on a state level. And it was then that I got involved with the New Hampshire Young Democrats. They ran a program that we've continued and tried to strengthen, which is called 603 Forward.
Right.
And that helps support young candidates like Tim and other folks where we endorse them. We hope to help them out financially. Try and hold signs when we can and, give advice if they need it, to try and encourage other young people to run and try and get young folks elected because, we believe that as an aging state, it's important to have the voices of young people represented. We represent the future of New Hampshire, and we're going to have to wrestle with all these sort of the results of all the policies that are being put in now. So we feel like it's very important to have our voice at the table, especially when you have issues coming up like voter ID with Bill O'Brien, by
Right.
name going after young people's right to vote. As we talked about last week, the slashing of the university system by 50%, us being 50th in the nation for state support for education. So that's a big part of what we do as the Young Democrats. Try and get young folks elected. We also try and talk to young folks, get them fired up about Democratic candidates. Because I think if young people take the time to look at each candidate and what they stand for on the issues that are important to young people, there's an absolutely clear choice. Republicans have slashed public education. They've slashed Pell Grants. Scott Brown's plan for higher education is all smoke and mirrors. He refuses to, support the Bank on Students bill, which would do some amazing things for a lot of my peers and Tim's peers who've graduated
Yes.
with all this student debt. I think it would be a big boon to the millennial generation, which is really struggling in this post-recession economy. So we try and make sure that young people are paying attention to elections, getting them fired up about elections, making sure they come out to vote, and connecting the dots so that, when Senator Shaheen pushes for the Bank on Students bill, that young people in New Hampshire know about that.
Right.
When Congresswoman Carol Shea Porter pushes for similar legislation in the House, that people really take note of that, and that we're publicizing that on our social media as much as possible. The great work the governor has done to put in a tuition freeze for
Yes.
UNH and then, tuition reduction for the community colleges that folks know. So when they go to the ballot, that's just a really easy choice.
Increased funding for higher education and a tuition cap. Governor Hassan, her policy is to try to keep the best and the brightest students here
Absolutely.
in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
When you have Boston 55 miles away. And in our last show, you talked about a friend of yours that went to the State University of New York system because even with out-of-state tuition, it was cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
This
Yep.
is vital.
Mm-hmm.
Vital.
Yeah. Another issue that's big, we're paying attention to a lot of different races. One that we're paying particularly close attention to is Councillor Chris Pappas.
Yes.
Because, especially for young people, but for people across the state, people often ask, what's the executive council and how does that affect me?
Right.
Well, they're making big decisions about, whether Planned Parenthood has a contract, whether women can get access to health care, and then particularly for young people, whether we have commuter rail in the state. And speaking personally,
Yes.
that's huge. Never
Yes.
mind keeping folks in state for college. If you have professionals who could take a train down to Boston for a job, would love to live in New Hampshire. New Hampshire's
yes.
consistently rated one of the best qualities of life in the country. It's a fantastic place to live. It's a fantastic place to raise kids.
But without the infrastructure,
Yeah.
I often, when I was living in the Silicon Valley, I often wish that 55 miles away there was like a New Hampshire.
Yeah.
That you could, I could get in the car, go, and because, hey, I'm a New Hampshire boy at heart.
Yeah.
And the one of the great things about living in California, though, is the public transportation infrastructure. I could just live 30 miles from San Francisco, get on a train, you go up there, you go to all the events.
Mhm.
It would, but what it would do is attract, like you're saying, professionals, young professionals, middle-aged professionals, people that live in Massachusetts that have all this expertise that people like Dean Kamen says they need educated workers.
Right.
It would attract, it'd be a conduit, perfect, a rail link
Yeah.
to bring people into Manchester. Think of the
Yeah.
growth that would spur.
Yeah, in Nashua and Manchester, if
Yes.
it goes up to Concord, I think that'd be huge. And I think it would help bring and keep a lot of young people in the state.
Yes.
And so that's why, races like the executive council are hugely important.
Right.
And, Chris is a young Democrat, so we're definitely hugely behind him. But there's, paying attention to all those races and getting people to really understand why that's so crucially important. There's a
Right.
big race against Dave Wheeler, who had been in there before, for Deb Pignatelli's seat. That's Executive Council District 5. Making sure that Diane Sheehan gets in because
Right.
she's a huge advocate for commuter rail, where Dave Wheeler was really the he went against all these Republican businessmen who were really for this in his district.
yeah.
They were furious with him.
It's a totally
Has it-
bipartisan issue.
Yeah, and that, except for these extreme right-wing ideologues, and Dave Wheeler's a perfect example of an extreme right-wing ideologue.
Chris Pappas has a huge base of support in the business community.
Yeah,
which
among
we're always-
lots of Republicans.
Right.
Yeah, because
Well,
he gets things done.
And, it goes into something that a lot of people have mentioned to me over the last few years. The Republican Party in New Hampshire, back in like the 1990s, were way left of where they are now.
Right.
You could have a discussion with Republicans in the 90s about, how much money should we spend on rebuilding the school. Now, those responsible Republicans who are interested in getting a good value for the taxpayer,
Right.
They've retired and moved on, or they've,
Been
stopped
bounced
doing,
out of the
yeah,
party.
or they've been primaried out, and now you have the extreme ideologues where the question isn't, how much should we spend on rebuilding the school? They come back and say, should we bother to rebuild the school?
Yeah, it's
and
unbelievable.
that's not a productive question. That's you can't look at government like that.
Because you get folks like the Free State Project that come into small towns like Grafton, and they went in and cut the town budget by 50% just to do it.
Right.
That's a totally new breed of Republican.
That's their ideology.
Yeah,
And
just
Ti-
to do it.
Tim, it's not that the Republicans were left. It's they were in towards the center.
Well, they were more left
Center.
of where they are now. They've
But
gone way off the cliff in
These
recent years.
Tea Party Republicans, there's no inclination for compromise.
Right.
Or to be in the center. Because the part of having two parties in our two-party system is we eventually will get a compromise that, is centrist.
Sure, and I think it's really healthy for the debate when you have two parties.
Right.
Other things about the Republican Party that balance out the Democratic Party and vice versa. But
Right.
if you don't have two functioning parties, it's
parties.
not good for the state. It's not good for the city.
In California, the hard right, when I moved there first, got there in '85, I was at Defense Language Institute, and it was pretty well established Republican party. But eventually, the hard right, reactionary nuts, we always said they're from Southern California, SoCal, Orange County and that, they really harmed the party to a degree that's where it crippled it.
One of the most interesting things that I saw when I was running in 2010 and talked to Republicans about this is the beginning of outside, especially D.C. money, coming into state rep primaries.
Yes.
Right.
We have 400 state representatives. Those are huge. So you have 800 candidates running, if not more in those primaries.
The Koch brothers are
Yeah,
here.
and in state representative primaries, that's mind blowing if you think about
In
it.
District
crazy.
Hillsborough District 17, Ward 10, Manchester, where Tim and I are running. Our opponent, Tammy Simmons, 4 or 5 months ago, said that AFP, the Americans for Prosperity, the Koch brothers, already had boots on the ground in Ward 10, knocking on doors.
Yeah.
It's just amazing.
Yeah.
And I tell people out of state, and they just can't quite believe it.
Yeah.
The level of the Koch brothers' involvement. But I want to, before I get to Tim, because I'd like to ask you a few questions more about infrastructure from last week's show. Isn't there a young Democrat running against Steve Valancourt?
There is,
Our wonderful, wonderful Steve Valancourt.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot after Steve Valancourt's recent really despicable
We don't even have to mention his
comments
don't
about
want to.
Congresswoman Annie Custer. There's a great young Democrat, Ryan Curran, running in Ward 8. And I've been encouraging people, as Steve's comments make more and more national news, go hold a sign, donate $10. Friends of Ryan Curran, check it out on Facebook, research him on the web.
He's a good guy.
Yeah, great guy, and there's a wonderful chance to replace one of the more off-base Manchester representatives, so that'd be wonderful.
Yeah.
Sometimes, don't they? They have a dollar coin up in Canada. I think they call it the loon. Steve might qualify. They have a $2 coin. That's the toonie.
I'll refrain from comment.
But Tim, we were talking about infrastructure development, privatization. We were talking about infrastructure development, how the Tea Party Republicans are against it, which has a disastrous consequences on economic growth in New Hampshire. We also talked about why they're against infrastructure funding. And my personal idea is because it's a great opportunity to privatize infrastructure, generate a great deal of money for one's campaign contributors. And I used to write about finance when I was in California. I wrote about the bond market. And when you privatize, let's say, if you privatize the prison, or if you had a private prison, or a highway or a school system, oh my, guess who gets involved? The bond dealers to underwrite those bonds. There is so much money and there's so much graft, whether it's legal or illegal, because we know there are various types of graft that are legal.
Oh, yeah.
And I know you are very passionately opposed to graft in all its forms up in Concord when you're serving.
Well, I'm opposed to graft and abuse of the financial industry anywhere. At the local, state, national, international level. The financial meltdown back around 2007 is one of the things that actually got me reinterested in politics, got me motivated to get prepared and run for office and everything else. Where my background, I've been studying economics all my adult life. It's an interest of mine.
You're a member of the American Economic Association.
Yeah. Some people they fix old cars as a hobby. I read boring economic journals as a hobby because I'm a nerd. Once we started to see the chickens come home to roost around 2007, 2008. Which was the end result of 25 years of deregulation, and self-regulation, which was a joke. It really kind of got my blood boiling a little bit. To illustrate the scale of the problem, and this is something that is still an issue. All of the bailouts that George W. Bush did and all of the Band-Aids that President Obama championed, they were a first aid kit trying to treat like a sucking flesh wound.
Triage.
It was like level 1 triage against a terminally ill patient. If you look at, I'm going to try not to wander too far into economic jargon.
Okay.
But if you think about it, there's a total amount of U.S. dollars that exist in the world. It's called M0. It's the amount physical dollar bills and coins that are printed. And, that's about $4 trillion.
$4 trillion.
Which is a lot. And if you take another measurement, M2, which is the physical money that exists plus all of the credit that banks have created out of thin air, it gets to around $11 trillion. So, M2 is generally considered to be the widest possible estimate of the monetary supply. So let's say that, based on that, there are 11 trillion US dollars out in the economy.
Right.
If you look at, for example, the interest rate derivatives market, now this is one of those things where when I talk about this with folks who don't follow economics on a regular basis, they scratch their heads and they ask me,
what is a derivative?
Well, no, when I explain how interest rate derivatives work, they ask me, why does this even exist? It's like VX nerve gas. Why would you even invent that? An interest rate derivative is a contract between me and Theo, where I give Theo the privilege of borrowing some amount of money from me, $10, at a specific interest rate, 5%. And he's gambling that the interest rate will go up. And that will give him the option in the future of borrowing money below the interest rate.
And he pays for this.
Yeah, and he pays a little bit of a premium.
Okay.
So if he decides not to cash in, I still make $1.
Right.
But if he cashes in, let's say the interest rate goes, from 5 to 8%, he'll still save 50 cents by cashing in on this IRD, and it's called an interest rate derivative because the value of that contract we make is based on the interest rate. It is a derivative of the interest rate. That's what derivatives are. They're financial things that don't actually exist in a physical form that have value based upon something else. The total notional value right now of the interest rate derivative market, the total financial value of all of the outstanding, not yet cashed in, but still in term interest rate derivatives is over $700 trillion.
But that's bigger than the entire world economy. What's the entire world economy?
That is
about 1/10 of that?
That is larger than the entire M2 money supply of the entire planet Earth. Times 5.
Jeez.
It is absolutely ridiculous. And the scale of this is its own problem. That is only one type of financial derivative product. That's not even getting into, the synthesized, collateralized debt obligations that were made out of all the subprime mortgages. That's not getting into all the insurance, the credit default swaps, and all the other crazy stuff that's going on. That's only one type of product.
Sure, you can sell consumer debt 6 times. You
Yeah,
have
exactly.
no idea who owns your debt and if they have a right to collect it or not.
Or who owns part of your debt. That's a whole other problem.
But Tim, isn't this the word used to be when I went to university? It was called speculation.
Yeah.
And speculation was considered to have triggered the Great Depression. And we were taught, somebody like John Kenneth Galbraith was a god then. This was before the Chicago School of Economics and trickle-down economics, which, dear viewers, was test labbed by the Brazilian junta, and back in the 64 to 80, where the whole idea is you impoverish the lower classes, bring all the money up, and create capital at the tiny elite, and then all the benefits start trickling down. The thing was, it was a military junta that would actually had death squads because if the poor got troublesome.
Well, we're not looking at.
We're not there yet. But
that'll never happen.
Speculation was considered the most dysfunctional thing, and then suddenly, speculation, starting with Reagan and the Bush, just runs wild. And the point is, They did away with many of the laws passed during the Great Depression to end speculation, and within less than 10 years, we get the Great Recession, which the laws against speculation were there to stop, and they worked for almost 3/4 of a century. So what can be done?
Well,
what can be done?
Speculation, is one part of a larger
Yeah.
problem. And on its own, it was destructive, but it wasn't an atomic bomb because people were doing speculation against, like, cattle futures, against the price of oil.
Like in the Chicago Board of Trade,
Yeah,
pork bellies.
It really went out of control once people on Wall Street realized they could do speculation against the dollar itself.
You mean, and these contracts, which are just hot air almost.
Yeah,
they're not even real products.
Where they could speculate, against or for the value of the U.S. dollar against the interest rate. We talked about interest rate derivatives. It's a primitive form of speculation.
If you're talking about gambling, and once again,
Yeah.
we go back to the 70s and 80s when I'm at university, a casino, once again, is the very definition of a dysfunctional economy. And it seems with Reagan and our two great Bush presidents, he said sarcastically, we've created an economy that's a casino, and many people have crapped out.
Well, it really is. The problem comes in. They have this laissez-faire ideology of never have any government regulation over anything in the industry, and the free market will sort it out. But even folks like Alan Greenspan, whose laissez-faire free market credentials are unquestionable, they will come out and say, yes, there is a point at which,
Right.
if the government does not come in and save the day, the world economy will explode. And we saw that. I mean, we were there in 2007.
At the brink.
Yeah, that wasn't some theoretical thing. That was like next week. People are going to start not being able to get money out of the bank if the government doesn't come in and do something. And it only got that bad because, as you mentioned, the pattern of deregulation let it get that bad. And, nobody needs these draconian policies, where we outlaw financial speculation and investment or anything like that. But it needs to be regulated so that it stays responsible.
Mm-hmm. Once again, we go back to responsible. Theo, once again, is the voice of the young Democrats. What does this mean to you? This incredible, a casino.
Well, just speaking for myself, not for any organization.
What does it mean to young people when you're trying to plan a future? And you're not in America of the post-World War II era where my parents could count on you have a job. You have the job for 30 years.
Yeah.
You can send your kids to college. You can have a house and that. You're in a casino where you're expected to roll the dice.
Yeah. Well, I was just reading a really interesting article this morning about the job market that millennials face. And I'm looking at it myself, looking at jobs that are, not full-time, don't come with benefits, looking for myself, seeing that that's what I've come to expect when I'm applying for a job. Yeah, I haven't seen anything, that's going to come with reasonable health benefits or, if I'm lucky enough, 40 hours a week. And the article was going into all the kind of the delay of adulthood for this generation. They're
Right,
saying,
25 is the new 21.
Yeah, folks who are financially dependent in part on their in part or in whole on their families, staying in higher education longer, just because you just can't meet the bills, even if you have 2-3 part-time jobs.
I have another question for both of you. We'll go with you first, Theo. Minimum wage. How important is it to raise the minimum wage? And what do you think about these Republican arguments like Mitch McConnell that raising the minimum wage will destroy 1 million jobs?
I think it's ridiculous. I'm definitely an advocate for the minimum wage, especially for young people. You look at who is taking 2-3 minimum wage jobs to make it work. It's young working mothers, working families, kids just out of college. They say this is all high school kids, but if you look at the statistics, it's really not. A big majority is young folks who are out of college or out of high school who can't, find a job other than that. Theo, and they can't live on it.
Theo, you're young. Your perspective is young. I'm going to be 55 soon, and when I go out, I see people my age working minimum wage jobs.
Yep.
There are people that have once you're laid off, and I've just got laid off by Yahoo. This is my 4th layoff because of outsourcing, and you had the opportunity. You could go back to California, or you could stay here. Mm-hmm. and they're ending telecommuting. Very canny move to get rid of older workers. That I've put my roots down here now, and I didn't want to go back to California. This is my home. But I see increasingly people in their 50s, 60s working jobs that young people would.
Well, here's the tie-in.
Yeah. And they're on the minimum wage.
Sure, and here's the tie-in. You had folks who thought that they were
secure,
who thought they were about to retire, and their investments, their retirement investments, up in smoke.
Oh, let's not get into that.
No, and
my
then
401k.
Yeah, then you end up having to take a second job, or you
Right.
end up having to work a lot later than you think you would have to.
Yeah, increasingly retirees are going back to work.
And you end up, oddly enough, with this really sort of horrible competition between young folks
and old.
who can't find a job, and old folks who can't retire.
Right. Now, Tim, as a state legislature, tell our viewers, why doesn't the state of New Hampshire have a minimum wage law?
We don't have a minimum wage law because the Tea Party legislature that was sent in 2010 repealed it.
And
Very
what was
simple.
the logic of that?
It's ideology. They don't believe in having a minimum wage.
They don't believe in having a minimum wage. What is the Tea Party? What? You've seen, you've been around them more than I have. You've argued with them. What? It's just, I'm sure Theo, you're more controlled emotionally than I am. It's like, what the heck is going on here?
It's pure ideology for them. They see the minimum wage as, government intrusion into private business, without any regard whatsoever for the impact it's going to have out in people's lives.
Would the Tea Party, the Tea Party, would they want 8-year-old children, these mills back with 8-year-old children in them? We never had that in New England.
I think that is a fair question to ask Tea Party people who are running for office.
Yeah.
I would love to let them speak for themselves on that. I take the absolute opposite viewpoint on something like the minimum wage. I'm a capitalist. I believe in having a free market economy.
I do too.
With the caveat that one of the functions of government is to make sure that the free market economy doesn't cannibalize itself.
Right.
And one of the ways we do that is with the minimum wage. And, what the minimum wage does, it's such a good solution for 50 different reasons. Having higher wages at the lowest level of the economy allows successful businesses like, Auntie Anne's Cookie Shack to expand their customer base from average consumers.
Exactly.
And that allows companies that have a successful business model to operate their business model and make money organically rather than with a tax cut, which is artificial. And only helps companies with a crappy business model. And part of believing in a free market is that we have to accept that if a company has a bad business model, I'm sorry, but they're going to go under and be replaced by the next guy who comes along with a better product or a better way to sell that product. And welcome to capitalism.
Well, okay, Theo, we got one more minute, and we're going to give it to you to sum up.
Thank you. I think the minimum wage fight sums up the difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. The Republican Party thinks if you give tax cuts like the Bush tax cuts to the rich, they're going to spend money and create jobs. Studies have shown the wealthy are the most likely to stick that away and not spend it.
Derivatives.
Democrats believe that if you up the minimum wage, more people will have money in their pockets and are statistically more likely to spend it. These are folks who, they get extra money in their paycheck, they're spending it on food, they're spending it on housing, and they're spending it on consumer goods. There's a limit to how much you can spend if you're a billionaire.
Yeah.
How much does an extra private plane do to the economy versus millions of people going out and spending more on food and small businesses.
Well, I'd like to thank you. I thank you, Tim. I'm probably going to have you back again because you have a lot to say.
Sure.
And Theo, I'd love to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having
what
me.
office are you running for, by the way?
I'm running for county treasurer in Hillsborough County.
Well, you have my vote.
Thank you.
Well, Ward 13, it's that time again. Good night, and we hope to see you next week.